For those of you who don't know, Susan Paterno is the director of the Chapman University Journalism Program. She's the mother of 4 recent college grads, and I'm sure she'll sprinkle in her stories about what went on in her own family. She's also an award-winning journalist with more than 20 years of experience. She's written for the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and U.S. News and World Report. And we are really looking forward to learning more about Game On, which some I've seen written and have called it the playbook of Hunger Games for higher ed. So, and tonight, the way we've kind of organized this is we're going to talk a little bit about the history, about how we as a country and colleges have gotten to where we are today, like why the system is so chaotic. Some specific advice for parents who are in the process now about how they can manage it. And then maybe talk about, are there things that we can all do to potentially change the system? May not be immediately, but kind of as we can work together to change it for the future. So thought we would kind of attack it in those 3 categories. But welcome, Susan. Thanks for being here tonight.
I am just thrilled to be here. I'm excited to see so many faces from all over the country. This is wonderful. I am so also excited to hear your perspectives, all the people who are here, what's happening in your state, what's happening in your town. So I definitely hope we'll have time for questions and comments at the end.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, so it's really great to be here. First, I just want to put everyone's mind at ease. If you have students who are about to embark on this journey through the college admissions industrial complex, that remember, most colleges accept 50% or more of their applicants. So keep that in mind. Many, many, many great colleges accept 70% or more of their applicants. Most private colleges are discounting tuition more than 50%. So there's a lot of good news out there. The question is, as someone who went through this process, how do you find the most affordable degree, the highest quality and most affordable degree? So I think Debbie wanted us to talk a little bit about that tonight. But before we get there, she did mention that I am a mom. My husband and I raised 4 children. 2 went to the University of California, 2 went to Harvard. We have been through this many times, and we have come back from it with lots of tales to tell. I also was on the university where I teach. I was on the admissions committee for almost 10 years. And a lot of the reason why I decided to write the book was because of my experience on the admissions committee, seeing how the sausage is made, understanding and talking to other admissions officers all over the country, that what I experienced in my university is not so much different from what most universities do in that kind of very private, very secret admissions room. So I have some stuff to share about that. But just lastly, I just want to say that I really did write this as a public service to help families. So if I in any way can help answer your individual questions or your individual concerns, I'm more than happy to do that.
That's great. Thank you, Susan. I mean, I would, you gave us some of your background, but I'd love to people to have a sense of, in the book, like I guess the first quarter or something, you kind of go through the history of, and not that I want to dwell too much on it because it's the past, but I do think it kind of gives people a sense of kind of why we are here today. And knowing how we got here also might help, think about how we can change it in the future. So I think it's important to maybe go, if you don't mind, go through some of the highlights that you think were some of the most important things that really shifted to create the atmosphere that we're dealing with today.
Yeah, well, the first half of the book is all about how we got here. And it goes way back in history, but I won't go that far. I'll start where modern admissions really started and how the problem really worsened. And interestingly enough, it sort of mirrors my own path to college. My parents were first-gen immigrants to the United States, and they both graduated from City College in New York, Brooklyn College actually, which was considered the Harvard of public colleges. And they raised 3 kids, and we benefited greatly from programs in California that subsidized tuition for students. Middle class students got California state scholarships. They were able to get generally almost free public higher education degrees through the University of California or the Cal State system, community colleges. And then in the 1980s, all that changed. So in the 1980s, you had an ethos of government is bad. And Ronald Reagan actually got elected on a platform that government is bad. And he was one of the first to try to, well, he actually did impose tuition on the University of California system, which started in the 1980s and started to really rise in the 1980s. So during the 80s, you had this idea that government is bad, the free market is good, and there were a lot of free market lawmakers elected who advocated for cutting tuition subsidies, state tuition subsidies. And then you started seeing more and more market-driven practices that drove up tuition costs. Embracing these market solutions led to the rise of US News and World Report, for example, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, the rankings. And as soon as that magazine came and decided that it was going to be the arbiter of what is quality in a college education, that unleashed a whole bunch of forces that caused the mess that we're in now. So yeah, that the whole idea that the free market was going to drive the economics of higher education created sky-high tuition rates, cuts to tuition subsidies at public colleges and universities, and so many families like my own struggling to figure out, how do we afford college?
And so what was the reaction of the colleges like dealing with US News and World Report's, the rankings? Because it was like, it's a little bit of a love-hate relationship back then and even today.
Yeah, well, I have a whole chapter. Chapter 3 is devoted to kind of looking at the history of US News and World Report rankings, which when I was researching the book, I discovered there was very little written about it. It was almost as though US News had scrubbed the record, and the public record at least. And it really required me to go back and search archives, search primary materials. But it was a game changer for families, because they didn't really know how to assess quality. And tuition was really rising really in the late 80s and 90s. And they didn't want to spend all that money for a degree that they felt wasn't going to have any traction in the marketplace. So basically what US News did is just create a whole bunch of rules. They made up the rules, and the universities and colleges didn't really have a choice but to follow those rules. So the end result, Debbie, the question that you asked is, how did that impact? Well, what ended up happening is the colleges and universities hired a whole bunch of consultants called enrollment managers to learn to teach universities how to game the system. So there's a whole chapter of that in the book too, the academic arms race, how the colleges and universities really started figuring out ways to boost their US News ranking. Some of them just flat out cheated. Some of the best known colleges and universities, and I do name names, just flat out cheated. They got caught, but it didn't really impact much about the public's regard for these rankings. So the public really embraced the rankings, and the universities and colleges ended up having to institute or actually manipulate financial aid to boost their rankings. And I
don't really think it's really personally until maybe the past 5 years. I mean, even though a lot of those stories of colleges, manipulating the rankings happened more than 5 years ago, it feels like the public didn't really become astute to what was happening until kind of, again, within the past 5 years, that it's really come to light about, oh, don't look at the rankings. They're not really worth it. And, but yet they're still there.
Right. They are still there, and they are information, and that's okay, because information is always good. It's always good to know, to have facts. Facts are always a really important part of the college search process. But I think the most important thing to know about how enrollment managers work is they basically, they want to find students who are going to be the most worth to them. In other words, they're looking for students who are going to help them meet their institutional goals. And you guys as family members, you'll never know what those institutional goals are. Sometimes it's rankings, sometimes it's revenue generation. you just will never know. And so that's why I always try to tell families, you can't game the system because it's too secret. The best you can do is try to figure out how to find the most affordable degree. And like I said, there's a lot of great colleges out there. You just have to find the one that is going to give you the best deal. And that is a little bit more difficult than you might think. Merit aid colleges use steep discounts to recruit the most desired candidates, and everyone else gets loans. So basically you have to be aware of that when you're going into it.
Yeah, you made a comment in the book, which I thought was just kind of, very valid, but it's people don't realize it's actually not, as you started off saying, it's not that hard to get into college. What's become harder is to be able to just afford it.
Exactly. I think too many families are persuaded by the rankings to think, oh my gosh, we'll pay anything to get our child into a quote unquote brand name college. And if you can get into the dozen or so colleges that promise to meet a family's full financial need without loans, and Harvard happens to be one of them. Actually, to be perfectly honest, our kids got a better deal from Harvard than they did from the University of California, which is shocking. But Harvard has, I don't know, billions of dollars in endowment, and they and the Ivy Leagues have the best financial aid packages. Now, that said, our daughter had to turn down her first choice because she didn't get enough financial aid. So, it's
Wait, and which was her first choice? Did you?
Williams.
So Williams, which is a pretty generous school, on the spectrum of schools. So
Yeah.
they did not offer as much financial aid as Harvard. Interesting.
No, so she, so that's the only reason to try for those really brand name schools. And honestly, there's only 12 that I think there's 12 or 15 that promise to meet a family's full financial need without loans. And those are in the book. In fact, in the book, I actually list all the different colleges and what their financial aid policies are. But you need to know what the financial aid policy of the school where your child wants to go. You need to understand that quite thoroughly, because you would think Williams actually is one of those colleges that promises to meet a family's full financial need without loans. But their assessment of our need was a lot lower than we had assessed our need. So we just flat out could not pay $40,000 a year to send her to college. So which is another black box in this system. I mean, there's the black box of what they're looking for to actually admit you. And then there's the black box, quite honestly, even of the CSS profile of what the college's calculations are of how they're using the information that you're providing on that form and what the number is that they're finally using. You don't know that until the end of the process. You do not know. And I wrote a column for Forbes about that recently. I just did a couple columns for Forbes about that very problem. You get that your kid's heart is set on Williams, and you get that financial aid package, and then you have to say, no, sorry. It's a really terrible process to go through. So I think if you start at the beginning, and as I say in the book, find that financial fit first, and make sure that everybody in the family is on board with what you all can, what you can afford to pay. So you're not going to face tears at the very end of the process. So you have to just kind of be aware of that as you're going into it.
Maybe you could talk a tiny bit more about that financial fit, because also I think there's a lot of advice or guidance about fit in general, but I think a lot of that comes from high schools and comes from the colleges. And when they talk about fit, to be honest, they're talking about like that more fantasy fit of of the academics and the social. And this is your best place ever, that you'll have these, you'll spend 4 years and have memories for life, but they don't really talk about the financial fit. And what I loved about your advice is that that's really the number one thing to start with.
Yeah, absolutely. And here, well, let's just put it this way. If you can pay near or full tuition, your child's going to be fine. As long as your child has pretty good, decent grades. Tests are becoming less and less important. The SAT and the ACT are becoming less important. There's a lot of private colleges right now that just definitely need those full payers, or they're near to full payers to meet their revenue goals. So if you're that person, you know what, just breathe a big sigh of relief, because your child's going to be just fine. There's tons of great colleges out there. If you're like me and our family, we just didn't fit in that, we really had to kind of figure out how to make this work. And I have to say, we didn't do it very well. I really honed in on that when I wrote the book. The colleges that meet your full financial need, you can find those in the book as well. You can also figure out how colleges dole out financial aid. Are they merit aid colleges? Are they private colleges? Are they public colleges? I mean, you have to take all that into consideration when you're looking for finding that financial fit first. You can choose to use the net price calculator, but I will tell you right now that a lot of times that net price calculator is outdated or not accurate. The best advice that I try to give parents about finding the right financial fit is look for those schools where your child's academic profile is in the top 10% of accepted applicants. So you can find that information on the website of these colleges. They will tell you what their average GPA score of accepted students. They will tell you what the test score average is. So there's ways to find that out. If your child is in the top 10% of that, then you stand, or the child stands a much better chance of getting a merit aid scholarship to a private
And maybe
college.
connect that statement to the rankings issue and to the enrollment management algorithms.
Yeah, it's all quite complicated. That's why I just try to simplify it for parents, because again, you can never know what the institutional goal is. Maybe this year the institutional goal is boosting revenue. So it's quite possible that they're going to take a student whose family can pay full or near full tuition over you or your child, even though your child's academic scores are better. So you just can never know. And that really is why US News and World Report is so insidious and probably just needs to stop, because it drives colleges to behave in ways that I don't think they normally would behave, actually, if they weren't pressured by rankings. So in other words, if they need to have more kids with test scores in the upper ranges, then they'll offer huge tuition discounts to those families. And you might get into NYU, your child might get into NYU, but might not be in that applicant pool, the top 10. So yeah, you're accepted, but you don't get any tuition discount. You don't get any merit aid. You don't get any scholarships. So each college is very different in how it apportions its financial aid. And they also call it financial aid when it's not financial aid. It's generally loans. And that's another thing that shocks parents when they get the quote unquote financial aid letter. It has a little bit of scholarship money and a little bit of financial need money, but mostly it's just a ton of loans. And I think we should probably talk about loans.
Sure, no, go for it. Continue on.
Well, I would say only accept government subsidized loans. Don't take Parent Plus loans. Don't take private loans. Those can be Parent Plus and private loans can be huge traps for families, because you end up not realizing how much money you're actually borrowing. And we borrowed, there's an anecdote in the book about my own family. We borrowed over $100,000 to send the two older boys to college. And, it's hard to pay that off.
Did you not realize it? I mean, obviously that was not, it wasn't like in one shot you were signing,
it was
$400,000 that added up.
It was just so easy. They basically said, here, have money, here, you can borrow as much as you want. And, when you have other kids at home, as we did, and we had bills to pay and mortgages and, tuition was going up. So sometimes it's just so easy to take out those parent loans and you think, well, we'll pay it back eventually. But if you are considering taking out those parent loans, read the introduction of the book where, I basically lay bare how difficult it is to pay those loans back. So I always encourage families, find other colleges and universities, even if it's your state college and university that's going to offer you a better deal. Don't burden yourself going into retirement or your children going into their careers with loans.
So just to be factual, I mean, a student can only really borrow about $27,000 or up to $31,000 on their own from the government. So if the first thing, we're saying is find a financial fit, it's really whatever the family can afford, plus this additional money that the student can borrow on their own from the government. And that's really, in its truest sense, if we're going to say what that they can afford, that's kind of the max without going on beyond to, private loans or the Parent Plus loan. So that's the range that families need to start now understanding the system, understanding how colleges, handle their financial aid and kind of work backwards.
Exactly. Absolutely. And, that's not a lot of money, but on the other hand, do you really want your child to graduate with, a lot of debt? It's hard in this environment. It's hard enough to find a job, let alone find a job that's going to support that level of debt. So I also in the book interview students who took on $100,000 in debt and just struggled, still struggling, now 25 years later, still struggling to pay back that debt, because that is debt that can never be discharged in bankruptcy. And that's something that parents and students need to know. That debt will follow you around to your grave, and it will go to your heirs.
I didn't know that way. That it will follow you around as a parent and as a student. It's not just the student it follows around.
Exactly. So, excuse me, let me just clarify. Whoever has that loan, it's whoever has that loan. So if you are a parent and you co-signed on a loan for the student, then yes, that's your responsibility. If your student alone signed on that loan, which is what happens when you take those government subsidized loans, it's the student who signs. They don't make the parent sign.
But for the Parent Plus loan, which is just the parent, that stays with them.
That is those are treacherous waters to swim.
Susan, there was a question about a little off topic, but still kind of in the realm that we're talking about. Somebody was asking about the UCs that, they've become very competitive even within state, to get into the UCs. And yet it's hard to get merit aid, from other schools out of state. So I'm assuming that the person who wrote this is like a California resident and they feel squeezed.
Yeah. California, that is very true. You're not, yes. So the short of it is, I'm sure if the parent who wrote that is from California, she or he understands that if you're in the top 9% of your graduating class, you are guaranteed a spot at a UC. Okay. So it's not going to be necessarily the UC of your choice. And you're absolutely not going to get probably a lot of money if you go out of state. But then again, that depends. And in the book, I go through, I list actually the states, universities that offer the most money to out-of-state students. So you can actually go to the book and find out what state universities those are. So again, that's kind of part of the game, right? California is cracking down on having or giving any discounting to out-of-state students because they want to protect the UCs for their own citizens, which I absolutely 100% agree. So you do feel squeezed, but then you have to strategize, right? And so that's kind of the second half of the book is how do you strategize to find the best college or university at the most affordable price. And sometimes that might mean going to UC Merced, and parents don't like to hear that. They don't like to hear that, but that is just the reality of it, right? And you're going to get a great education at UC Merced. You're going to have great faculty. You're going to have brand new facilities, right? It might not be in the place where you imagine college should be, but what are you there for, right?
So when do you think is the ideal time for families to start to understand the process? Because too often, parents come and it's not until maybe that summer before senior year when it's like, okay, well, let's sit down and get started doing this. And you can still learn, but when would it be more ideal for them to really start to figure out, at least, understand the game plan, you know what I mean? Of how the system works.
Right. I just, I feel really strongly that students shouldn't have to be burdened by thinking about all this stuff when they're.
No, I say you're absolutely right. I say parents need to.
Yeah, parents should start reading as much as they can and paying attention as much as they can as early as they can. And it's important that you seek out great information. Maybe you read articles that show up I write for the Washington Post and I write for Forbes, and I know there's other people who are doing good work on these topics. But I think what I didn't have when my second two kids were looking at colleges and it came out of the blue and I was so shocked by all this is I didn't have a resource. And I just had to read a lot of books, like 5 boxes of books to make sense of this whole process. And so I think trying to put it in one place, which is what I tried to do with my book, to just give parents that big overview and see what the big picture is and how do you start even thinking about the small details of coming up with a list, right? So how do you look at the big picture and then find those 10 colleges that you want to put on that list? And that's what I tried to do. And I think that's a really good start. I think parents can't start thinking about it too soon. I know that sounds terrible.
No, it's fair. No, I mean, because it is a complicated system. It's a process that really does take, over a year, even if you know the system. The process takes over a year from at minimum from start to finish of real execution of what, families and students need to do. Yeah. So, the better you go into that execution year, kind of armed with your knowledge and having done the research ahead of time, and maybe even having prepared yourself and your student, the better, of an outcome you'll have. So I
just think educating yourself is always a really good thing. Just understanding what it is you're getting into before you get into it. Because I know that in our case, our third child became obsessed with private colleges and we in high school, and we didn't really pay attention until it got too late, and then it was insane. So I think being educated is going to make this process a lot easier on you if you just know what awaits you, and if you're strategic about it and you plan for it, so it isn't these deadlines coming so fast. I mean, it's crazy, and you feel like you're going crazy and your children are going crazy, and it's really a very disorienting process if you're not ready for it.
So go back a tiny bit, and because you mentioned, if a family does do their work, they recognize their financial fit, and maybe their child can't get into the schools that they truly want to get into, but they can still get into some good state schools, and they're going to get a good education. Kind of give your interpretation of how people can decide, what is good teaching, because I think that's hard to kind of to measure. You can't really measure it. So what are the things that families can look at in a school and say, okay, maybe this doesn't have the brand name that, my kid maybe could actually get into the school with the brand name, but we can't afford it. So they're going to go to this other school, still looks like a good school, but how do we really know that the teaching is as good as we think we know at the other schools?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. As someone who is a college professor, and I teach every day, and I observe a lot of other professors. For me, I just first of all, it depends on your student, right? Because some students thrive in huge lecture halls and some students don't. And I found that my own children two of them did fine in a big, huge university, and, two of them needed smaller classes. I needed smaller classes. So
I'm listening to a podcast. Is that okay?
Oops, sorry, we're just gonna go ahead.
So I think that talking to your student and asking your student and finding out how does your student learn best. Okay, so figure that out, number one. And for me, it would be small class sizes, because what's most important, studies have shown what's most important to student success is mentorship. So getting to know the professors, being able to go to office hours, making sure that the faculty know the names and will mentor students is very important. But that can be done in any environment, honestly. I mean, a motivated student can get as much mentorship at UC Berkeley as my older son did, as you can at, say, Chapman, where I mentor students all the time, because my largest class is 10 students. I mean, I know all my students from day one. So it really depends on the learning style of the student going to college, right? And then go and start digging through the websites. What's so great now about college is you can find out just about everything you need to know on a college website. You can find out class size. You can, you can talk to admissions officers. Sometimes you can even get a look inside a classroom. They sometimes have live cams inside classrooms. So I think the important thing is figuring out how your student learns, and then finding a match between your students' learning needs and a college or university that will meet them. And that means, again, doing your research, right?
Yeah. So
And-
this
and
research
having-
is a combination of like quantitative and qualitative. I mean, because, you know,
Right.
what you just mentioned is a little bit more, I mean, there's not going to be a number that says, you know, teaching quality at this UC is 9.6 versus, you know.
Yeah, we wish the US News and World Report had done that, but they
Right.
didn't. You know, they decided that a great measure of a college or university is the scores of incoming of seniors in high school, right? Which that doesn't make any sense, because students arrive at college and they have massive transformations from freshman year to senior year. And you want to make sure that your student is protected and also has the opportunity to have that kind of intellectual awakening at college. Too many students I see think of college as 4 years of extended partying and Greek life and that sort of thing. And that's really not why you go to college. I mean, it's certainly one part of it, and I endorse having fun. But I think the other important part that we forget is finding a place where your child can have the opportunity to really expand him or herself intellectually.
And talk a little bit about, and I'm personally a believer in this because I feel like this my own education kind of rested on this, but it really is, having the skills of critical thinking. If you can think critically, if you could change jobs 10 times, and you can always try and, come to a new job and figure out what you need to do.
Right. And that is the hardest thing. I would say I've been teaching now for 25 years. And I would say that the thing that I notice most is students come in with very poor critical thinking skills. They're good test takers, but they cannot solve problems very well. And so critical thinking, most people don't know what it is, and I'll just boil it down. It's really basically understanding and being able to identify the difference between fact and opinion. And students have a very hard time with that right now. And I think that might be, there's a lot of reasons for that. Social media doesn't distinguish between fact and opinion, but trying to teach students to marshal arguments, and that's what we do in critical thinking, and support their opinions with facts and find ways to solve problems by going through the process of breaking that problem down into small manageable bites and figuring out how to find solutions. That's a very difficult thing. And I think a lot of colleges talk about critical thinking, but you really need to get into the weeds and ask them, what is that? What does that mean? So when you hear an admissions officer say, we value critical thinking, raise your hand in the meeting and say, what does that actually mean? How do you value it? How do you teach it? What is it? I ask students all the time, what is critical thinking? And they can't answer the question.
Well, and even to your point about asking colleges questions, as parents, as students, we shouldn't be afraid to ask during this, to some extent, it's a honeymoon period where you're trying to get to know them before you make the decision about if your student's going to apply. People, I think, still sometimes are a little afraid to, that there's the college, they know everything. Like, I shouldn't question I shouldn't necessarily ask them questions, and I shouldn't then even question their answers when they give me an answer.
Oh my gosh, that is so important. That's a great point, Debbie. You have to go into choosing a college like you're a reporter trying to find a story. And the why and how are super important questions, right? Don't take what they tell you at face value. Ask them, well, how do you know that? Or why are you doing that? Or provide me some facts to support that opinion. You just told me that your school has the best film school in America. Well, how do I know that? What facts support that? So what you're going to hear on college tours, whether they're digital or in person, you're going to hear a lot of opinion, a ton of opinion. Force those admissions officers to support that opinion with fact, and absolutely ask questions. That's the only way you're going to find out if it's the right place for your family and your child.
Okay, I'm going to just announce the 5 people who are getting a free book tonight. And Mindy's going to put their names in the chat, and she's going to put her email address so you can contact them. So the first is, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing these names correctly, but Ernestine Baines, congratulations. Saqib Khan, Lisa Falconer, Ellen Wyatt, and Roxanne Welch. So congratulations, you guys are getting your own copy, so you can read all of the details that Susan is alluding to.
Well, very exciting. I'm so excited. I hope you enjoy it, and I'm always available to answer questions if you have any. I'm very easy to find.
So Susan, let me ask a few questions that I'm seeing in the chat. So one person is saying, I'll read it, but then I think I'll summarize the point. Asking, should we reach out to need-aware colleges to let them know we are willing to pay more than what our EFC states? Or basically they're saying, should we tell colleges that we have more to pay, or we're willing to maybe even pay full price? And will that make a difference?
That is such a great question. And I can answer this with certainty because I've sat on the other side of the table. You don't need to tell them anything, because basically I'm letting out the secrets here, but there are identifiers on your student's application. And yes, they do look at your EFC and all that, but they know what you can pay and they know how to leverage that. So I wouldn't worry about that. I much more, if I were you, I would feel comforted by knowing that, especially a lot of colleges now are looking to boost revenue by admitting students who have the ability to pay. So I think that's great for you, but I wouldn't say that. It's not like bargaining for a car, right? You don't want to do that. So until you get to the very end.
So it's so I guess, and actually this person, and I'll scroll back to there, it is kind of obvious, who can pay and who can't, from just basics sometimes of demographics. And especially if you're going to fill in, do the FAFSA, do a CSS profile, they can obviously see. And then if you don't, well, obviously that's another sign that says, I don't even need to do these forms because I'm willing to take whatever, the college is going to ask me to pay.
And I do want to say that this is another thing parents don't realize. Need blind universities, that means they don't take into consideration what you can pay. All right. And so Chapman is a need blind university, but when we're in the room where we're assessing candidates, we can see, if you're a lawyer, if dad's a lawyer and mom's a doctor, and the kid went to a private school, and they all know the private schools, all the admissions officers know all the private schools. So you can see and guess what that EFC is going to be. So even need blind schools do talk about that.
So that's interesting. So they don't maybe have the actual numbers in front of them, but again, it's pretty evident, from just pieces of the application, what that family status is.
Exactly. So I think really money becomes the issue at the beginning when you're trying to search for the right schools. But need aware, as the parent who probably knows, need aware universities are need aware because they are upfront. They're not going to give a lot of financial aid out, except if that particular applicant is one they really, really want.
So you didn't really mention like the part of the process about if people can appeal, what offers that they get. So, we go through, it's usually in March, maybe February through April, and students get their packages and offers from multiple schools. What are your thoughts about families going back to colleges at that point and saying, I need more, this isn't going to work, or, things have changed?
Yeah, no, totally think now that's when it does get, to like buying a car, sadly. But you have to do it in a way that doesn't offend their sensibilities. So the best way to do that is to take the offer that you got from one college. Let's say, college A isn't really where Janie wants to go. Janie really wants to go to college B, but college A gave Janie, way more money. So then you go to college B and you say, hey, will you match this deal? We really would want to go to your college, more. Sometimes that works, and it works great. It worked great for our older daughter. And we did that with Williams, and Williams said, sorry. So, but it never hurts. It never hurts to ask, right? Because the worst they can say is no.
Right.
But you want to ask very nicely. So don't kind of cop an attitude and, go in with guns blazing and say, I demand that you meet this offer, because that will make it go south real fast.
There's another question here asking, when colleges say they will meet 100% of demonstrated financial need, how do you find out before applying which colleges don't meet the need and actually include loans? So they're saying they meet 100% need, but they're still including loans.
Right. Okay. So those are up front. They're in the book. You can find, there's a list of them in the book of who it's called promises to meet full need without loans. And again, I think there's 12 or 15 of those colleges, and then everybody else. So if we look at almost 3,000 colleges and universities in the nation, we're talking about an infinitesimally small number that promise to do this with no loans. Yeah, so there's no way, because the rest of the colleges just call financial aid loans, right? So it's not really aid, it's forcing you to borrow. The only way to really do that is to dig into the websites, right? And then I try to use the jargon of the universities in the book, so that you could just Google, meets full need, blah, blah, blah. They use a lot of jargon, but I try to break it down for everybody. But that's the only way to do it, is to find out what is the policy of that particular college or university. Do they?
And again, that's not an unreasonable question to ask.
No, absolutely not. They'll tell you.
Right. Mm-hmm. Another person's asking, which we haven't touched on yet, but I think this is a good question. What about graduation rate? How important do you think that is? What numbers are really actually shown by the government and by colleges?
So graduation rate is a super controversial topic right now, because a lot of times colleges will reject students they don't think will graduate, right? Or students will end up attending a college and taking out so many loans or having to work so much that they don't graduate. So I'm not sure how to answer that question, because most colleges want to graduate their students. So some actually manipulate the graduation rate to their benefit for US News ranking. So that might mean that a student who doesn't, who comes from a background that doesn't necessarily have all the advantages of an upper middle class suburban kid will be rejected, because they think, wow, this is going to cost us a ton of money in financial aid, and what are the chances of the student actually graduating? So graduation rates are really about each individual college or university. You kind of have to look at the policies of each college and university, because sometimes those with the lowest graduation rates are low because they're accepting a lot of students who are struggling, and they're doing their very best. For instance, there's one near us called Laverne that does accept a lot of students from backgrounds that don't have the advantages of affluent students in the suburbs. UC Riverside is one of the same kind of colleges, and they do commit a lot of resources to trying to help those kids. So I think it's really important to kind of take a look at, in the book, I talk about different rankings, and one is a social, I can't remember what exactly
So
it is.
is it the social mobility?
Social mobility ranking, yeah. That where are the colleges that are really putting resources into making sure that their students that are coming from less privileged or less advantaged backgrounds succeed. So I try to address that, but again, it's individual to each student and to each institution.
So I guess summary, it's a good, statistic to look at, but you can't take it always at face value. You have to kind of understand what's underneath it.
You do, exactly.
So honestly, I can't remember, and I apologize, Susan, in the book, if you talk about, but somebody's asking about like the US system and colleges versus international schools.
Yeah, I do actually. I have that in, I think it's chapter 10. Yeah, I mean, international schools are a really good choice. They're not as hand-holding as we are here in the United States. So though you might get a better deal in an English language school, say in Germany or France, I don't think there are, schools in France are free, but I think they're all in French. So unless you speak French, I don't think it's going to help you out much. But UK and Canada and Germany all have great institutions teaching in English. Others do. I have those in the book as well. They're going to probably cost less, but they don't coddle their students at all. There's none of these resources committed to sort of, what we do to try to keep students, to try to make sure that they do well and they graduate and all that. That's basically sink or swim overseas. So if you have a super motivated student, and my kids have had friends who've gone overseas and done just great, Scotland, UK, Canada.
And some of them are 3-year schools too,
right.
So which saves
So
on costs. Yeah.
And also I want to put a plug in for community colleges, which I don't think get enough. They don't get enough attention, and they don't get enough recognition. But we have some great community colleges here where I am, and they do a wonderful job. I know faculty who teach there. They're really great, good professors, and you can save 2 years of tuition and transfer to a UC without having to take any of the standardized tests. So it's a really good option for students who don't test well, or maybe didn't do as well in the AP classes, or, they can go to community colleges for 2 years and do well and transfer and graduate with a degree from, a 4-year college.
So you mentioned tests, and we didn't really touch on that yet about the ACT, SAT. I'm curious what your opinion is about everything that's happening with test optional, and also maybe you give people a little bit of background, a little bit about the College Board, and I don't remember. I think I actually heard you in another interview talk about that you had some forensic investigators look at what's going on in the College Board. I think we should, maybe we'll make all of our blood boil, but I think people should hear it. What's going on?
Oh my God, this is a topic we could have a whole hour on. I did a Forbes piece about the College Board. I did hire a forensic accountant because in my research, I stumbled on these tax returns from the College Board that showed literally hundreds of millions of dollars in the Cayman Islands and in offshore tax-free accounts, which is kind of weird because it's like it's a nominal nonprofit. It's a 2 billion plus nonprofit, which on its face is ridiculous. But and this forensic accountant, try as he may, we could not figure out what they were doing with these hundreds of millions of dollars in offshore accounts. And despite my calling for weeks and emailing and sending the questions, and no one would ever respond. So I kind of wrote about that for Forbes, about, we don't know. I mean, the executives are paid multi-million-dollar salaries. So the College Board spends money on themselves and on the Cayman Islands. So beyond that, I'm not really quite sure what they do with their money. The test optional thing, I actually just sent a piece to the Post about test optional, the history of test optional. Test optional is going to be manipulated by colleges, and I'm going to throw that out there right now, because even though US News reduced it, I think, to 5% of the total score, the colleges are penalized for not submitting 50% of their applicant scores.
You
So
mean
what's
penalized in the rankings
in the
still?
ranking. So what's going to end up happening is the colleges are going to figure out, they're going to take the top, they're going to try to manipulate it so that they end up with 50% of their accepted students with
Having
high
scores.
and 50% with no scores. So that makes it even more difficult, I think, for parents, because how do you game that, right? I mean, if your student isn't a great test taker, well, then you want to go test optional, but then how is that going to impact your merit aid? Because they still, FYI, moms and dads, they still use test scores to award merit aid. So each college, again, we have to keep going back to it. Each college is different. So you have to literally call them all up and say, how do you award merit aid? Is it based on AP tests? Is it based on AP scores? Is it GPA? Is it test scores? No one has come out and said we are, except for the UCs, no one has come out and said we are not using test scores to award merit aid, except for the 70 colleges and universities that are test blind, which is to say, like the UCs, they will not consider ACT or SAT. So
yeah, I think when this like test optional came about, people took a sigh of relief. Oh, this is going to be, so helpful. But personally, as a parent and in this space, I think it's actually made it more confusing.
It has made it more confusing because the colleges are saying that, it's great. It is great for the colleges. It's going to increase their applications. So their numbers of applications will increase. So they're going to reject more kids. And so they're going to look like they're more selective. So it's great for the colleges, but it's not so great for the families trying to figure out, what do we do now? And I have a whole chapter called The Tyranny of the Test, and I wouldn't amend it one single bit. It's to my mind, the College Board needs to go. We need to demand that the College Board be transparent at the very least.
Isn't this again, like, it's a strange thing? The College Board is supported by the colleges.
No, the College Board,
I thought
the revenue that they pay a nominal fee. No, they don't actually pay anything. The colleges don't pay anything. It's supported mostly by school districts that pay to give the test free during the school day. It's supported, AP brings in, I think, $500 million every year. AP testing, AP curriculum. So AP is its biggest moneymaker. So if you think about it, $500 million every year just from AP alone, not to mention how much they make hundreds of millions of dollars off their Cayman Island investments too. So it's not the colleges paying excuse me.
Well, I didn't mean dollar wise. I meant like they seem to just support the concept of the College Board,
Some do, some don't. Caltech, I don't think they take test scores. UC, they just said, we're not supporting you anymore. And, I think there's 70 colleges that will no longer take ACT and SAT scores. So it's, again, I think test scores are good information, but I don't think they should necessarily impact admission in the way they do now. I think that each college should be able to evaluate a student holistically. And if a test score is in there, not make that, because I'm telling you, at Chapman, we had this thing called the academic index score, which was basically a crunch number between GPA and test scores. And, that was the first hurdle. And a lot of colleges still do that. That's the first hurdle. You got to get over that hurdle in order to get to the table.
Right. So there's a question here about early decision, which we didn't really touch on, but any thoughts about families applying early decision, their student gets in, and what if they truly still can't afford the package that's being offered?
So in the book, I have a whole anecdote about this, actually, about a family that applied, or a student, obviously not the family, applied early decision and then became completely frantic because could not afford it. And so it ends happily for that family, but I can tell you that it often doesn't end happily. So early decision is great if you are a family that can pay full or near full tuition. Go for it. Your odds of getting in will be so leveraged that I would absolutely say go early decision. I forbid my children to apply early decision anywhere because, again, what Debbie alluded to is there's a whole program. In the book, it explains all of this, but there are many colleges that have this thing called binding early decision, which says that if you get in, you got to go and you got to take whatever financial aid package we offer you. And so unless you can prove serious financial hardship, that's where your child's going to go. And they're going to give you a really crappy financial aid package. So it's much better to wait and get those offers that you can then leverage to get a better deal at the end of the spring admission cycle. But if you're wealthy, or if you can afford to pay full or near full tuition, early decision is your holy grail. Go for it.
So there's another question. I know we don't have that much more time, but maybe this will kind of lead into just the final few questions and comments. And we won't go into really detail, but there's something called the common data set, which is basically the information that colleges are sharing, and it's really what U.S. News and World Report bases all of their ranking information on. And so, and I've always kind of had this curiosity too. How come there isn't any checks and balances of this data? There really isn't even technically there's not necessarily checks and balances of data that colleges supply into iPads, which is the government system. This is a huge financial decision at the end of the day. Honestly, I used to work in the credit card world. You could not put a number, anywhere without it having been run by several lawyers and making sure that your calculations were accurate. And yet here is data that's being, shared left and right, and nobody really checks. Nobody can check whether or not it's valid data and truthful.
Yeah, well, welcome to America. Capitalism. Private schools can basically do whatever they want, and it's on the honor system. And that's what we value in this country. That's market-driven economics. And private companies, private colleges, they get to do what they want. Now, that said, you can double check on public schools. So all that information is public. So you can get absolutely accurate information, unless they're lying, in which case that's a whole different thing. But I would imagine they wouldn't, because if they did lie, they could go to prison for it, basically. Not private, right? Because you can't get that data. So that's basically the end of it. I mean, that's why, in my mind, the way we start to change this system is we start to insist to our elected officials that they make public higher education affordable again. And if that means free tuition, that means free tuition. But it gets sticky and thorny because each state gets to decide how it runs its own state public higher education system. So until that day happens, we're just all at the mercy of basically private enterprise, because a college is a company.
Right.
It's a corporation. It's like any other company or corporation, except some are public, and therefore you have more transparency.
I think it's been clouded in our eyes for so long, because it's company / academics, and we still think of academia as this, ivy tower that doesn't do anything wrong.
Well, I think there's enough evidence since the 1980s, and I quote a whole heck of a lot of it, the facts and figures in the book, that would say it's time to start reorienting that attitude. But I think in the United States of America, we embrace the idea that private enterprise can do, private corporations can basically keep that private. I mean, that's just capitalism.
So what do you think? What's your, if I gave you a crystal ball, or maybe, or I said, what do you think, Susan's going to happen in the next 5 years, with higher ed? We came back in 5 years. What do you think? What are the possibilities?
Oh my God, I am not a predictor. I'm a fact finder. I like to find facts, and I like to, see patterns and make sense of those patterns, but predicting is just not what I do.
Here's my question. There is a lot of financial pressure on some schools, because, particularly the smaller ones who are revenue driven, who don't have the brand name. And, we're talking about capitalism. Is it horrible to say that if you can't survive you can't survive? I mean, is it, is it the survival of the fittest of these colleges? And if we don't have the supply of students, that some schools may go out of business, is that a bad thing?
Here's the thing. Right now, it would be a bad thing because choice is good. And until the state and federal government gets a handle on making public higher education affordable in the same way that we have K through 12, which is free right now, we need to offer that as an option to students, because what will end up happening is, in my mind, and I guess this is a bit of a prediction, people will flood the state colleges and universities because they will be affordable. And that will bring down the prices of the private colleges, right? Because they'll have to compete to get those students back. So they'll have to allow for much more reasonable tuition. And yes, some colleges that can't do that because, they'll go out of business. But I don't think it's good that they go out of business until there's an alternative that's affordable. And right now, in so many states, I mean, we are blessed in California to have an amazing public higher education system. We have UCs, we have Cal States, we have community colleges. The Cal States are relatively affordable. You get a great education there. But there are some states out there that have basically very poor public higher education that serves mostly affluent people. And that's not okay. So I think, somehow or another, the federal government and the state governments have to come together and rectify that situation and provide the opportunity in every state that students deserve.
Yeah, it's not so unreasonable these days. I actually have had parents contact me who have students going into ninth grade saying that they are thinking of moving to a different state so that their child can be, able to go to that state school when they graduate high school, because they know that the state that they're in does not have good state schools, and they want to move to a state that has better state schools. I was shocked when that first happened, but it's happened more and more that people are thinking that way. I mean, people who kind of are able to kind of grasp the system and kind of think further ahead. But it's kind of a smart move if you think that way.
Yeah, but here's what I would say: stay in your state and fight for better opportunities, right? I mean, if we all abandon our states, then what's left? So yeah, and I do feel for parents. Again, why I wrote the book. In the meantime, while we're all trying to figure out how to make this work, I wrote the book so that parents and students would have an opportunity to sort of figure out a way to wend their way through the system. But at the same time, guys, stay in your state and fight for better opportunities for everybody, right? Because that's the only way we're going to see change, if we decide that we're going to fight for the collective good.
Okay, well, thank you, Susan. There are some other comments, but we'll go through, or questions, we'll go through them and try and answer them in a follow-up email. I really appreciate your time. Again, good luck to the 5 lucky winners. Thank you, Susan, for sharing your knowledge, and everybody else who didn't win, consider purchasing the book. Besides learning a little history, you'll have definitely tactics to use right away and good lists of colleges to look at, in the different categories that we talked about tonight.
Oh, it's just been a great pleasure to see all of you. And again, if you have follow-up questions for me, I'm more than happy to answer them.
That's so nice. Thank you, Susan. Okay. Good night,
everyone.
I'll say
good night to everybody and have a wonderful week.
You too.
Thanks, Debbie.
Bye.
Bye-bye.